All right, good morning. So my name is Arnaud Vaganay. So I'm a BITS catalyst, and today's session, or this morning's session, the first session, is a gentle introduction to the rest of the day. And we're going to talk about the literature review, which I think is rarely discussed in the discussions about research transparency and reproducibility. We often, neglect to talk about the literature review, and it's weird because it's the first thing that the reader will reads when in a paper. So this is our cover. So yesterday we motivated the use of open science. Why does it matter for research to be transparent and reproducible? So now we're going to take it for granted, and I'm going to assume in this presentation and in subsequent presentation we're going to assume that you all agree that research should be transparent and reproducible. And today and tomorrow we're going to look at how we can implement these principles in research, starting with the literature review. So using the cover slides, so I would say that the literature review is probably part of the design stage of the research, because you're going to use the literature review to tailor your research question. So it's part of the research proposal, I would say, although it involves some kind of data management. So it probably spans these two part of the research cycle. So like I said, I'm a quick word of introduction. I'm a catalyst of BITS, and I am also a director of this organization, which I created this year. It's called MetaLab. So I spent, before I did my PhD, I spent 6 years working as a policy researcher. I was working for different governments. And a few years ago, I decided to do a PhD, and so I moved from doing research to doing research on research. And the point of this organization, which I created this year, is to do research to try and understand what makes good science, i.e. what makes credible, trustworthy science, and also what are the drivers and obstacles to good science, right? So, and we try to do this research in a very interdisciplinary way, i.e. involving social scientists, but also people with different backgrounds, like medical doctors, engineers, etc. So like I said, in this presentation, I'm going to assume that transparency and reproducibility are fundamental norms of science. And this leads me to formulate 4 questions with regards to the literature review. So the first questions I'm going to tackle in this presentation is, why do we need reproducible literature reviews? What is a reproducible literature review? How can you do them? And what are the limitations what are the trade-offs involved? Starting with a justification of the reproducible literature review. I did a very small classroom experiment when I prepared my slides. And by the way, that's the first time I'm giving this presentation, and so your feedback is more than welcome, orally, or you can send me emails after that. I do systematic reviews or evidence reviews or meta-analysis for a living, so I'm used to reading a lot of papers. So I didn't have to read a lot of empirical studies to assess the reproducibility of current literature reviews, because I have a pretty good idea myself. But just to convince you, so I took 6 empirical studies from different disciplines in journals with high impact factors, and I was interested to find out, okay, what do the authors say about the methods used to collect the studies in the literature review. So these are in different fields: criminology, economics, education, geography, healthcare, international relations. And I just read quickly the literature review to find out if there was any kind of information and methodology saying, okay, well, the literature comes from that database using these keywords, etc. And as you can see, and I was not surprised by the results, I don't know if this resonates with your own experience. Usually, so you get between, I don't know, 50, 70 references, right? And it's hard to know where they come from, right? You just get a nice story, usually it's well written, but we're not very clear as to where this literature comes from. does it matter? Does it bother you when you read, I don't know, what do you think? Does it bother you when you read a literature review not to know where the literature comes from? Sometimes. Yeah? Sometimes. Do you think about it? So when you read, do you ever wonder, or you would not expect a methodology at all when you read a literature review? Yeah?
I don't know if I'd expect a methodology, though now I feel maybe I should. But I often see in psychology, here are some studies supporting an argument, but the ones against it are missing.
Ah.
They don't fit, fit the story.
And how can we know that there are studies missing?
Well, I might know if I'm a reviewer because I know the field, but if you don't know it very closely, you probably wouldn't.
Okay. Well, that's a good point. Yeah, the reason why it bothers me slightly is that all the papers that I've read, they make some kind of claim about the social or the scientific importance of their paper. When you read a literature review, the conclusion of a literature review is typically, oh, and it's the first time that, someone is going to try that methodology, or it's the first time that, we're going to empirically test that theory. And I'm like, okay. So you can see here that in these 6 articles, I found every time, without fail, a big claim, usually. However, no study has, to our knowledge, used open-ended survey questions to measure public support. To our knowledge, this is the first published study to date to quantify the proportion of missing blah, blah, blah. So this is why it bothers me. It's because the author, the investigator, used her scientific authority to make a claim about the importance of the paper, scientific or otherwise, right? And so this implies that actually the investigators did a very exhaustive and comprehensive literature review, right? Or that it's not exhaustive, but the literature we reviewed is actually representative of the broader literature, right? And these are very big claims. Do you think that, we've already answered this question, but do you think that, how confident are you when you read a literature review that the whole literature, that the whole relevant literature has been reviewed, or that it is indeed a representative sample of the literature in the field? Well, I am not very confident, especially given another literature, which is about citation bias, i.e. what sort of papers do we reference in our own research. I took this article as an example. There are many more. There's a whole literature about citation bias, but it shows that the studies that are cited in a paper are not random. Usually there is some kind of bias, i.e., for example, in this paper, the authors found that papers with statistically significant studies were referenced or over-cited in medical research. There is no such research in the social sciences, but I think it's good to know that there might be a risk of citation bias in our own research. And so without a clear demonstration, the reader can only assess the credibility of a claim based on the reputation of the author, the reputation of the journal, or your own knowledge which gives an advantage to senior researchers over junior researchers. And I would say that even if you're an expert, so my discipline, I would say, is meta-research. I'm interested in meta-research and meta-science. I would not pretend that I know the whole literature about meta-research and meta-science. No way. And why? It's because the scientific production has become so huge and enormous that it's impossible to know it all, right? So, so we have to be perhaps a little bit more modest about, okay, what we know of the literature. So I think we need something better than, the methods that, whatever they are, that methods that we've used so far. And this is what I'm suggesting in this presentation. So a reproducible literature review. So what is it? It is a 10-step methodology that I've tried on a couple of papers. So it's the first time I'm giving this presentation. I'm doing meta-analysis, meta-research. It may or may not work on your own, with your own research and depending on your discipline. So I'd be very interested in getting feedback. So if it works with your kind of research, please, or if it doesn't work, please let me know. And my aim is to update my guidelines. So it's meant for literature reviews in empirical studies. And it builds on methods used in systematic reviews, right? And it also, so it's a mix. I'm using here methods used for systematic reviews, but also I'm making the most of the open science infrastructure. So it's, using these different advances in research. So again, these guidelines are under development. And I think that the key differences between a reproducible literature review and a non-reproducible literature review are the following. The first is in the objective of the literature review. So in a non-reproducible literature review, you aim for exhaustivity. Or it's an allegation, I would say, because you can't really prove it because you don't give us the methodology. You don't share the methodology, right? So, you can only pretend that your literature review is exhaustive, and it's an objective in itself. So you want your literature review to be exhaustive. In a reproducible literature review, the focus is more on the process, right? So you just want to show that your literature review was conducted in a rigorous, systematic, and reproducible way. And I would say that this reproducibility aspects, so it adds to the theory of what is reproducibility and what is a reproducible paper. Okay, I took this table, the first 3 rows actually, from an article written by Victoria Stodden, who's a leading scholar on issues of reproducibility. And she says that reproducibility means 3 different things. It means computational reproducibility, empirical reproducibility, and statistical reproducibility, right? So this is what she means by reproducibility. And I would argue that the reproducible literature review adds another dimension to reproducibility, which is also how reproducible is your literature review. The second difference between reproducible and non-reproducible literature review has to do with the meaning and the importance of the missing study. I was told when I did my PhD, which was not so long ago, that actually it was quite embarrassing to miss a study, an important study. Again, define what is an important study in a literature review, because it's a sign of incompetence. So it's embarrassing. But I think that when you do a reproducible literature review, you're aware that you may be missing a few studies. But it's just an error. It just has to do with the keywords that you used. But you did not mean to introduce any kind of bias because you don't really have control on the studies that are in the literature review. If that makes sense, right? You focused on the process. You didn't really focus on exhaustivity. You didn't want to be exhaustive. You just wanted to have a very representative sample of the literature. The third difference is the balance between originality and replication. In non-reproducible literature reviews, there is a strong focus on originality. Like I showed you earlier, all literature reviews, virtually all literature reviews, focus on what is unique about this paper. This is the first time that we're using this methodology, first time we're using this variable, etc. As you will see later, in a reproducible literature review, there is a recognition that science is a mix of originality and replication. So because you collect systematically studies in your area, you can then say, okay, my study replicates part of this study by X, Y, Z, but I can also show you and I can also demonstrate that this part of my research is new, right? Because you have a very detailed overview of all the studies you reviewed. So you can say, my study is in line with or replicates this study, but it adds something new because none of the studies that I've reviewed use that particular methodology. So you can actually prove it. And finally, I think the fourth difference has to do with the role of disciplines. So non-reproducible literature reviews have strong disciplinary approach. So usually they focus on econ, political science, psychology, whereas the methods that I'm suggesting today actually ignores these boundaries. So it allows you to do really an interdisciplinary literature review. So now, how do we do a reproducible literature review? So the methodology that I'm suggesting has 10 steps. The first is what I call concepts mapping, right? So the first step is you need to map your keywords. You need to identify the keywords in your research. And you can do that in your discipline and in related disciplines. And you do that using the variables. So what are the key variables in my research? What is the key independent variable? What is the key dependent variable? So you can use these variables as keywords. And what is a bit trickier in social sciences in particular is concepts. A lot of papers use concepts, and concepts is a theory about the relationship between two variables, right? And this is what is tricky, because your variables, you know, are pretty easy to identify, I would say, but the concepts are harder to map, because we know what the concepts are in our discipline, but we don't know what terms or what words they use to define the same or to identify the same theory in a different discipline, if that makes sense. I'll give you an example in a second. So my suggestion to do that, to do your concept mapping, my suggestion would be to not do it on your own. I think the best way to do that is to consult different colleagues in different disciplines and ask them, how would you approach that research question in your area? And I have it happened to me actually. I once discussed, I was writing a paper as part of my thesis. I was writing a paper on time preference in research. So how is it that when you take studies that have more or less the same, study more or less the same thing, how is it, and I'm talking about experiments here, how come several identical experiments, for some of them the time given for the experiment is very long and sometimes it's very short. So I was interested in why is it that some experiments are shorter, much shorter than others, given that they're studying the same thing, right? In a political context, it matters a lot, right? Because there is also, I was interested in the effect of elections on experiments, etc. So I was saying to a friend of mine, who is a colleague of mine, who is a psychologist, as I was telling her, okay, I'm doing this paper right now on time preference, right? And she was like, oh, that's interesting. Do you mean present bias? And I was like, I don't know, tell me more about it. She was like, oh, present bias is, is the theory according to which we have a preference for a short-term payoff as opposed to a long-term payoff, right? So we'd rather, everything else equal, we'd rather have the payoff earlier rather than later. And I was like, oh yeah, exactly, this is exactly what I mean. And so it made me think, I was like, okay, in psychology, this is known as present bias. I'm interested in this literature. I want to know what they have to say about it, how they operationalized present bias, what sort of data they collected, etc. So I started reading this literature, and I found out that actually it was really relevant to my research, and it was actually, there was more literature in psychology than in economics or in political science. So it completely changed the approach to my research paper. So after that, I consulted a few more people, and I made that list of concepts that are related to what I was interested in. So present bias, time discounting, time preferences, temporal discounting, delay discounting. So they more or less all mean the same thing, right? The importance of time when you make a decision. Then what I did is that I had to check the definition, right? So I had to make sure that it was really what I was interested in. And so I found out that present bias was very relevant to what I was doing. But conversely, waiting costs, which was a word suggested by one of my colleagues, or early stopping, were actually not so relevant to what I was doing. Jeff?
Yeah, the recent slide, what is the meaning key? One means, is that how it's called in economics? The recent slide.
You mean this slide?
Yeah, one
Oh yeah, so, sorry, I should have explained that. So one means, it's a term that I found in the econ literature, psychology literature, political science, other. So I didn't find present bias, studies about present bias, outside of economics and psychology. Thanks. So you need, yeah?
Where did you search?
Yeah, so that's my, I'll get to that soon. I think in the next slide or so. So you need, so that's your concept mapping. So you have to bear in mind all the, so the point is to get keywords. You need to you want to have a list of keywords that are relevant to your research. Step 2 is build a search string, right, which you're going to use in bibliographical databases. And a good search string needs several iterations. It's hard to tailor. I mean, it takes a while to make to develop a good and effective search string. And an effective search string is one that includes all the most relevant studies. But in the meantime, you don't want to screen 1 million studies, right? So it has to be manageable. You don't want to, so you want to have all the most relevant studies, but you want to exclude the least relevant studies. So you want, you want again all your relevant studies, but you don't want all your relevant studies as part of a batch of 1 million articles. Ideally, you would devise or develop a search string that has, for example, 1,000 items and 1,000 relevant items, which is very difficult, a very difficult thing to achieve. So like I said, this will require different iterations. Giving you a few tips based on my experience. So first, aim for a manageable number of included studies. An included study is a study that is in your bibliography. So when you, in the disciplines that I know, usually bibliographies have between 50 and 100 references, right? So you don't aim for 200 or 300 references in your literature review because it's just overwhelming. So, so I would suggest anything between 50 and 100. You decide, depending on how much time you've got. But bear in mind that to get to a result of between 50 and 100 studies, depending on how good your search string is, you might have to screen as many or more as 1,000 studies, and this is why your search string needs to be very good, because you don't want to screen 3,000 studies. 1,000 studies is achievable because actually a lot of the information you need is in the title of the study or in the abstract. So it seems daunting, but actually it's just a few days of work. Use 2 or 3 different search engines. So for example, I use Scopus, Web of Science, PubMed, so I'd say use 2 or 3, and you will see that actually it's good because they do not perfectly overlap. So you will get studies that are referenced in Scopus and not in the Web of Science and vice versa. Use Boolean operators, and the Boolean operators are not the same if you use Scopus and Web of Science, or so you have to be familiar with search strings in different bibliographical databases. Amanda? No. No. I use Excel. Yeah, I will show you why. Because there's no analysis at this stage, at least. And use filters to manage the volume of studies. So if you think that, okay, your search terms are correct, right? If you think that your search string is, a good one, if you're pleased with it, but you get thousands or hundreds of studies, you can still use filters to exclude systematically. For example, because I don't have the time to review all this literature, so I'm going to I'm going to review the literature that was published after 2010, for example, 2012. And so that's by using filters, or you could exclude countries or regions of the world, or you can, so Scopus, Web of Science, and other bibliographical databases allow you to apply filters, right, and to do things systematically. So importantly, you need to keep a record of everything you do, right? So this is an example of a search string. So this is for the Scopus database. So this is what a search string looks like, but I'm pretty sure you've seen one before. So title. So this is a study that I'm doing at the moment on sponsorship bias in economics research. So I'm interested in these different concepts: funding bias, sponsorship bias, funding effects, blah, 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 blah. And then what did I use as filters? Well, the language is an obvious filter. The type of documents, so I was interested in articles or reviews. And then I used the publication year as filter. So I reviewed the papers published between 1999 and 2017. And I chose 1999 because I noticed there were studies published before. However, there's a peak after 1999. So you can see that when you look at the publication, there are many more publications after 1999 than before. So I recorded the dates of my search, the number of results, and I even took a screenshot to prove that, I didn't change anything. So this is a screenshot where you can see the search string and the number of results. And this is something that I included in the README file because, so you will see that the output is a spreadsheet with all my references. And then, in addition to the spreadsheet, there is a README file explaining all the steps that I took, and I add this as evidence. So the third step is to download the data and to create a data set, a spreadsheet actually. So what I do is that I export the results from the different search engines and then I merge them into a single spreadsheet with just the bibliographical references.
Yeah, sorry for the interruption, but
no.
I just wanted to give maybe a practical example.
Yeah.
Maybe where I come from, you find that sometimes...
Which is
Kenya.
Okay.
And you find that some of the resources, actually most of the resources are not online. So you cannot find them on the cloud. So, and some of them are very, very important. So how do you know that you have excluded some literature and yet you cannot find them?
So the question is about what do you do with the gray literature, or the literature that is not published on bibliographical databases? It's a very good question, and actually this is a limitation of the methodology so far. I.e., it's something that I want to think about. I don't have an answer to your question yet, and it's something that I've thought about, and it's something that I want to propose, extend my methodology so that it covers also the gray literature and the unpublished literature. But I would say that it's a problem not only I don't think it's specific to reproducible literature reviews. I think it's a relevant question to any kind of literature review. Do we want, yes or no, to include the gray literature or the unpublished literature? I would say, because I do systematic reviews, I would say yes, because the published literature is somehow biased. There's this problem of publication bias. But how to do it, I don't know, because the moment you start using Google or you open a can of worms, right? You get a million results and it's very difficult to filter. So this is an excellent question, but I still do not have an answer to that. But it's there. So hopefully in 1 year from now or in 2 years from now, we'll have an answer to that question. Yes?
Excuse me, so how does this spreadsheet look like roughly? So is it like having variables about the papers? Oh, okay.
It looks like that. That's a portion of it. I'm going to show you a larger portion of it later. So as you can see, it's a simple spreadsheet where each line is a study. And here you can see, so it's just like the first part of it. And at this stage, I'm only interested in the name of the first author, year of publication, title, and the journal, which I'm not showing here. And here I record where I found this information, right? And one of the first steps is to remove duplicates. You always get duplicates. Yeah. So when you do a search on Scopus on any bibliographical database, you can then export the results as a spreadsheet. And then you merge the results. So once you've downloaded all your results, you have to do a first screen. So you have to screen primary studies. And the first thing to do is to exclude duplicates, and Excel can do it for you, right? Can identify all the duplicates, so it's easy to find them. And then you exclude studies I try to use just the title. And if I can't use the title, then the next step is to use the abstracts. But I think there are a lot of decisions that you can make just using the title. So you exclude studies that are obviously irrelevant based on the title only, because you can see that one of the variables is irrelevant to your research, or because the type of research, the type of methodology is not relevant to your research. And what I do is that I also record systematic reviews or meta-analysis separately. So whenever one of these studies is a systematic review or meta-analysis, I put a 1, because I code them and I analyze them separately. And you've got to be super meticulous. You need to record every decision. So every time you exclude a study, you have to think, okay, I might have to exclude other studies that have the similar characteristics. And if later on, I want to narrow down the scope of my research, because it's still too many studies, so you need to be able to recode, to get back to your spreadsheet and recode studies differently, to exclude more studies, if that makes sense, right? So this is why you need to record every single decision in your spreadsheet. So this is another view of the same spreadsheet. So not a duplicate, so these studies are not duplicates. If it's a duplicate, it gets a 0. Here I coded the design, CS as in cross-sectional, using surveys. And then you can create categories, which is something I haven't done yet. So you can create, okay, this study is using survey data, this study is using another kind of data, systematic review. And then what I code is the independent variable, the dependent variable, and again, if it's a systematic review, I code it differently. I create a different variable. So this is what you do. And then you count how many studies you have in your bibliography. And if it's still too many, it means that you need to exclude more studies, right? Okay, so maybe I have too many years, or maybe I want to exclude blah, blah, blah. So this is why it has to be reproducible. So IV is for independent variables. So when you do a research, the most important variables, in my opinion, are what is the independent variable? Is it relevant to what I'm doing? What is the dependent variable? What is the data, or what is the context? What is the country? What is the time period of the study? So usually I use these four, actually, the research design. So usually I can do my screening based on 4 variables. Right. Step number 5 is screen secondary sources. So secondary sources are relevant sources that you didn't find with your bibliographical search. And it's very important to do that, because it could be that actually some studies relevant to your own work did not use, for example, in the title, the keyword that you were looking for. And this is why I'm really against what I call poetic titles. I think, and I'll get back to that later, I think a title should be extremely informative. I'll give you an example of what is an informative title later on. So you need to be aware that you're going to miss, by using these methods, just the bibliographical search, you're going to miss an important number of relevant studies. So what are secondary sources? It's studies that are in the bibliographies of the studies that you found. So studies cited by the relevant studies that you found. And this is what I call this is what is called a backwards citation analysis. So let's say that as a result of your first screening, you have 50 studies. So the next step is to look at the bibliographies of each of these 50 studies, because it could be that you will find more. Yes, it's annoying, absolutely right. However, it's super important. Why? When I did this research on sponsorship bias in economics, I actually doubled the number of relevant studies by looking at secondary sources. Just because my search string just because there are lots of uninformative titles. So it was actually very important. I doubled the number of relevant studies. So check the bibliography of all included studies and included studies not found in your initial search. What you could also do, however, I think it's less important, is a forward citation analysis. So you can look at who cites the study that is in my, who cites my primary study. So you do not look at the bibliography, you look at who cites this paper. And it's important when you have papers that have a lot of citations, or because, you know, they, for some reason they're very important author, so you would want to know who cites this paper. In my particular research, I looked at the systematic reviews. I wanted to know who cited the systematic reviews on the issue of sponsorship bias. So I did a forward citation analysis for just, I think, 5 studies. So that adds an extra step, and I added a few more, although far fewer than for backward citation analysis. So I added probably 4 or 5 relevant studies. And I would say that it's not so important. So backward citation analysis is very important. Forward citation analysis, not so much.
How do you do that technically? You're not manually reading bibliography lists, are you?
So for the backward citation analysis,
For both, I guess.
so for the backward citation analysis, so when you use Web of Science, Scopus, PubMed, so it shows immediately underneath the abstracts the bibliography. So you don't need to access the paper, so you can do it quickly. And then there is a link usually, so you can, if there's not enough information, right?
Can you download the bibliography, or like I'm just wondering what you're doing with that information, because you can see it on the page, but what do you do with it? You don't.
So I add, and I give it a different code. If it's a secondary source, I give it, which I can't show on the spreadsheet, but I say, well, this comes from a secondary source. This is a secondary source, sorry.
Copying and pasting that into your Excel file? No.
For the backward citation analysis, yes, what I do is that I basically copy and paste. As far as I know, there's no way of downloading the reference lists from a given study. So yeah. But bear in mind that you will only copy and paste the relevant studies, right? So it can be quickly done.
Yeah.
So how do you know that a study is relevant? So you use the title, and if the title is not, does not give you enough information, you look at the abstract. I only use the title or the abstracts. I rarely read the paper.
I think they have a bias there.
Oh, there could be a bias. We can discuss the biases later, yeah. Any research is biased, we just don't know how. And then once you've done that, once you're happy that you've identified the really relevant studies, the studies that are relevant to your research, then you need to extract data from them. So a little bit more than information than just what is the what are the key variables and what is the data and what is the methodology. So what I code usually is that, okay, so what are the key variables, but also how were they operationalized, right? What did they use as an outcome measurement? So this is what I do in the next step, right? You can code the research design, you can code the context, and you can code the findings. Or the conclusion of the study. So this is another view of my spreadsheets. So here, all these studies are relevant to my research question. So one in this column indicates that it's a primary source, so that I found it through a bibliographical search. Number 2 indicates a backwards citation analysis, i.e. it's a study that was referenced in one of my primary sources. And number 3 indicates forward citation analysis. Okay, so what I code here is, because these studies are evaluations, so I look at, okay, what was the intervention analyzed in this paper, what was the outcome, number of studies, because all these studies are meta-analysis, so how many studies does this meta-analysis include? Of those, how many have a financial conflict of interest, etc. So you have a good overview of your literature. Step number 7, like I said, it may or may not be relevant to your own research. Then you need to have a separate spreadsheet for systematic reviews, because and in this case it's complicated because actually all these studies are systematic reviews. But there are reviews of reviews. And I coded them separately, right? Because I was interested in for example, the mean effect size. So is there a measure of the mean effect size, etc. So the variables are slightly different. And it's not a problem because I think there's only 6 or 7 systematic reviews, so it can be quickly done.
I suggest a key for the stages.
Yeah, thank you.
We may forget that one means primary review. I suggest a key.
The code book, you want my code book, which I can give you. That's no problem at all because there is a code book. Step 8 is reports. So once you've identified all the relevant studies, you need to write your literature review, right? So it's not a step you can skip. So I would suggest that you report both the process and the methodology and what you found. So this is a nice way of reporting your methodology. You might want to include a flowchart and say, at this stage I excluded 50 studies because it's the wrong independent variable, or next step I excluded and my final sample, this is from a different paper, so it's irrelevant, and my final sample includes 13 studies or more. So you can report your methodology, and if you do that, I suggest you use a flowchart. And then you need to report your findings textually. So this is an example from a research proposal, so this document is not published, it's just an example. So the results show that sponsorship bias is a fairly well-documented problem. So you see here, I start not by what makes my study original. I start with what we already know, and I'm saying, okay, I'm not reinventing the wheel. I acknowledge that there's literature on the subject. It's a well-documented problem. A total of 81 items were found, including 57 empirical studies, 19 editorials and essays. Okay, these days I exclude them. It's one of my filters, right? Exclude editorials. 4 book reports and white checklists. This literature is also recent, with over half of these studies published since 2012. The vast majority of empirical studies assessed the prevalence of sponsorship bias at the study level as opposed to the journal or individual level. And you can see that I can document each claim that I make, right? So it's more transparent to the reader. And I think the conclusion is that, so among those, there is an overwhelming majority of studies, so 39 out of 41, evaluating treatment on health outcomes as opposed to environmental or social outcomes. So here I can prove that actually I was not interested in health outcomes in my research, I was interested in social, economic outcomes, and I only found 2 studies that did not look at health outcomes. So I can show you that actually this is my contribution, right? This is one of the first studies looking at economic outcomes, if you like. One good thing that you can do, I also use my reproducible literature review in the discussion section of my paper. So you finish your literature review, then you collect your own data, you analyze your own data, and what I do in the discussion section is that because your reproducible literature review creates expectations, right? The literature that I reviewed suggests that, yes, there is financial conflict of interest in research and that it has an effect on the findings, right? So it creates an expectation. And then I use the discussion section to compare my own results with the results of the literature and say, well, my results are in line with the studies that I identify in the literature or not. And if it's not in line, then I might want to suggest a few hypotheses. Maybe it's because I'm looking at a different country, period of time, discipline, whatever. And step number 10 is to curate your reproducible literature review. So I would suggest that you publish obviously your spreadsheets and your list of keywords. I publish the spreadsheet, and then any explanation about the spreadsheet is in the README file. So, and I publish everything on the Open Science Framework, right? And I think the nice thing about literature review, reproducible literature reviews, is also that you encourage reuse and updates. So the next person who wants to do the same study about, the prevalence of sponsorship bias in economic research will not need to do a literature review from scratch. The person will just have to pick up where I stopped my study. So for example, just review the literature published after 2017 if I stopped in 2017. Last question. So what are the limitations of reproducible literature reviews? They are far from perfect. I think, yeah, there's a question there.
Yes, can I ask you a question about the publication of the supplemental information?
Yeah.
Do you publish it in the actual article, or do you publish it as a set different, like in a different category? Like in population biology, there's the article and then there's supplemental information that comes out in Nature and Cell, etc. Where the supplemental information, you're allowed to just kind of just cram in whatever you want.
So the question is about where do you publish both the methodology and the findings of the literature review, right? Do you publish it as part of the article, or do you publish as an appendix to your research? That's a good question. I'm going to answer it in just a few seconds. So I think one of the key limitations is that it makes your report longer, because you have to add an extra section to your paper, which is the methodology of your literature review, which is non-existent at the moment. So it adds an additional section. So it makes the report, I agree, it makes the report longer. So my recommendation would be to publish the reproducible literature review separately from the empirical study. Okay, what you could do is to publish as a standalone article. So you can say, well, this is a literature review, and it's going to inform my next empirical study, right? So there are journals in which you can publish literature reviews. So I think if you do that, you can actually write a literature review that will inform 2 or 3 or 4 empirical studies, right? And I can do that because in my study on sponsorship bias, so this dataset will allow me to write 3 or 4 studies using the same datasets. So I'm considering publishing the literature review as a standalone paper, and then in the individual empirical studies, I will just make references to that literature review. And so that's an extra publication, if that's important to your, it probably is. So you can publish the reproducible, so that's one strategy separately. Or you can publish the details of the review process separately. So for example, in your literature review, you just report the findings, right? I found 51 studies, and out of those, 40 were surveys, blah, blah, blah. And for details on the methodology, please refer to the README file or to appendix. This is what I would do. I would not personally publish the methodology of the literature review as part of the article, because I think it makes it a little bit too long and boring. Second possible limitation is formulaic writing. There will be a lot of numbers in your literature review, and it will break perhaps the flow of the article. Out of 50 studies, half of them were surveys or whatever. But I would argue, it's a question of taste really, but I would argue that the point of the paper is not to tell a story. And I think there's a lot of storytelling in research. I think the point of the paper is to be really to the point and to be very informative. If later on you want to make a point, if you want to tell a story, which is absolutely fine, or if you want to discuss the policy implication or whatever, I would suggest that you write an editorial and you discuss the meaning or the contribution of a paper as an editorial or as a blog post or a magazine article or whatever. I think it should be it should be published separately, right? Third possible limitation is that and I think that could be a problem, I think it's an obstacle, is that it's countercultural. I think this methodology or this way of writing your literature review might raise a few eyebrows, because people are not used to this type of presentation. So it might be harder for you to publish, or your referees might wonder why you report your findings in this particular way. So I would recommend that you discuss with your editor, supervisor, if this is an acceptable way of reporting the findings of your literature review. And I would also argue that it's part of the wider open science movement. I think it's one of the logical consequences of this transparency and reproducibility agenda. It's not just the empirical part of the paper that has to be transparent and reproducible, it's also the literature review, I would argue. I mean, if you want to be consistent. And other issues, and then I'm going to stop there because if you might have some questions. I don't know if there are questions at this stage. Okay, so just after this slide, I'll take your question. Other issues that are not specific to reproducible literature reviews, but to any literature review, is that it assumes this methodology, or the literature review, assumes that titles are informative, i.e. you get a lot of information about what the study does. For example, you might want to get this type of information, and in my experience, a lot of titles are not informative. And I just wanted to give you an example of a title that I find quite informative. I wish all titles read like this: Industry Sponsorship and Publication Bias Among Animal Studies Evaluating the Effects of Statins and Atherosclerosis and Bone Outcomes, a meta-analysis. So here I've got my explanatory variable, my outcome variable, the data or the context, and then the type of analysis, the methodology. So I wish more studies, more titles were written. And I would encourage you to write these kind of titles as opposed to more poetic or fun titles. Question there.
My question is about the countercultural piece. So if you're saying that we shouldn't actually include it, as you gave an example of in the article, which sounds right, and you're really more just including like the summary of the findings and maybe a reference, how different is it really going to look other than the either appendix or something you publish on OSF?
The question is how, so if we publish the literature review, the methodology separately, how the literature review itself is going to look different. Sorry, can you ask again?
Well, you said what I meant, so I'll try to ask it a different way. Basically, like, how different do you think it's, like, does it really feel in the article if we're still, say, like, going to give the process somewhere that isn't the body of the article? Or are you actually suggesting that example would be what you put
This is only what I would put, personally, this is what I would put in the paper. Yes, I would just put the summary, and I would put the methodology and the flowcharts and the keywords, and I would put it as an appendix, not to overburden the article.
Yeah, so this is still like,
This is,
I would write, not what I would write. Like,
this is not how you would write your literature review, right?
Yeah.
So this is what I mean. So you need to have, it doesn't flow as well as a non-reproducible literature review where you tell a nice story. This is a limitation again of. Any other question? Yes, there.
You call it reproducible because somebody can follow the same procedure and come up with the same literature. That's why you call it reproducible?
I call it a reproducible literature review because I'm very transparent at each stage of the data collection process. So this allows the next person to independently do the same literature review and see if it gets the same, he or she gets the same studies, and if he or she comes to the same conclusion as mine. So I give the recipe of the cake, basically. I say, well, if you use these keywords, if you use this bibliographical database, if you use these filters, you will get 100 studies. And among my 100 studies, 50 of them analyzed, are based on survey data, blah, 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 blah. And this is why I think that my study replicates some of these existing studies, but it's also original because none of the studies applied this methodology.
Have you considered automating?
That's probably, but given that it still involves a lot of decisions, for example, the titles are not informative, so you still have to make a lot of decisions. No, I haven't. It's again I've tried this method just a couple of times, so I haven't reached that stage yet. But if you have ideas, please come to me, and I'd love to automatize this. If it's possible, I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, one more question.
I have lots of questions, but I had a specific question about your title and the terms, and I was wondering whether your databases that you search don't have keywords and why you wouldn't use those beyond the title.
So a lot of the studies do not have the keywords that I was interested in, right? And so how do I capture this information?
I think it's like a lot of base like Seattle or companies don't have the abstract and just abstract the keyword. I think it's like this.
Yeah,
So you can't search keywords.
Yes, so I'm in epidemiology and I would use PubMed and they have keyword
Yes.
that you would, so that each study is classified, I suppose that's not what happens in your discipline? Or? So you could have keywords that you would use including the title words. You could also include keywords that are used to classify the study, so you would...
In the abstracts.
Not, so yes, you could search abstracts as well, and you could, each study is classified according to the topics that it's, so PubMed has a system where there are people at PubMed who will add keywords and include those in your searches, so that you're really capturing bad title studies.
Okay, that's a very good point. So PubMed allows you to do more sophisticated searches than the one that I showed you. Thank you very much. I think, yes, you're right, this requires a bit of training, and I suggest you speak to your librarian, because they are the people who can help you devise and develop search strings that are very effective. I'm still new to this, so thank you very much. You can make your search string more sophisticated than what I showed you. So you can say, well, I want to look for keywords in the title, and I'm also looking for other characteristics of the paper based on information given in the abstract or other parts of the paper. Thank you.
Can I just
Yep.
make another general point? Because again, like my field is epidemiology, and so in our field, this is regarded as a study on its own. So I think that's the issue that other people might be facing in terms of, I would not write that way. No, I wouldn't write it that way if it's part of another study, right? Because that makes two studies in one paper, and nobody wants to do that, as you said. But certainly, if you keep it as a separate study, and I think that culture needs to change perhaps in other disciplines as well, we need to recognize this as an important step, and I think that's what your work is doing, is in recognizing that this in itself is research, is a form of research that has a very clear methodology that needs to be described and published separately.
I agree. So the point is that in health sciences and in biomedical research, literature reviews are published separately. It's a review, it's a paper, it's a standalone paper. Whereas in social sciences, we always start a paper with a literature review. My suggestion is that if you want to make the most of this research, like I said earlier, and I agree with you, I think literature reviews should be published separately. And the nice thing with doing this is that actually you can use the same literature review to inform different empirical studies using, you know, slightly different variables or different methodologies. So I agree with you, but I think that in social sciences it would still be expected by the referees and the editors to start the paper with a literature review. So I think this is maybe a step that I'm suggesting to say, to move closer maybe to the health sciences. First, we need to make our literature review, the literature review that is embedded in the empirical study, more reproducible, and perhaps in a few years from now we will come to the conclusion that actually it would be better to be published separately.
Yeah, thank you. Two issues. The reproducible literature review, is it always as short as what you presented to us?
Does it, sorry?
Is it always as short as what you presented to us? Is it like a paragraph?
Oh no, this is just a very short, no, it should be longer. Usually it's, so the question is, I showed you just one paragraph, but just as an example. Are literature reviews, basically the question is this your literature review? This is really short. No, it's not. My literature reviews are slightly longer. Thank you.
Yeah, the second thing, you just presented the paper, the topic, in maybe medical research or whatever. I think the nature of the title also depends on the kind of the journal. Because the journal you presented is more of methodological, so the method used comes out very clearly in the title. Unlike other kind of journal outlets that maybe they may not be much living empathy.
So is it that the article, the title that I showed as a good example, is more valid, this one?
Medical research methodology. So the
So
method
that-
comes up clearly because it's a methodological, it's more that unlike any other journal outlet may not be.
So is the comment that actually this type of this type of title would not work in a journal that is more focused on methods?
It would not be relevant to include maybe the meta-analysis, methodology that we have used to be included in the title.
Okay, yeah. So the point is that the methodology should be included in the title.
No, he's saying sometimes it's not.
Sometimes it's not. Okay, okay. I get why do I think that this information is? I get your point now. Why do I think that this type of presentation, this type of title is informative? It's because it's personal bias. I'm a systematic reviewer, so these are. Exactly, this is what I consider relevant in a study. These are the characteristics that I find most relevant. But it could be that to another, that's an excellent point, thank you, to another reader with a different agenda or different focus, this would not be informative. Maybe that's a limitation of the methods. And Katie, are we okay with time? Can we take another question? Or
Only just one more.
just one more question, Jeff.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. I'm really impressed. It's the first time I see a literature review, that is replication of the literature review. All the time we have been replicating the methodology, the data, and whatsoever. I have a concern with the way forward. That is, if somebody wants to continue the same, something you started, just continuing from what you do, there may be a bias. Because someone may find a paper which is irrelevant, or which you did not...
Which I excluded.
Which you excluded, and it can be a sort of value addition to what you did. So I suggest that if you want to conduct a replication of literature review, you should take, if you are not continuing the work you started, if it's a different person, you should take all those steps and then add what you have to add.
I think that the time-consuming part of the reproducible literature review is downloading all the results and eliminating duplicates and eliminates the obvious irrelevant studies. But I'm very transparent as to what sort of criteria I used to include or exclude a study. And the next researcher could say, well, I disagree, so I'm going to change the coding of that variable and include the study that you excluded. Because there is no decision with this spreadsheet, there's no decision that I'm hiding. Hopefully everything is transparent. So you might want the next researcher, anyone can use the spreadsheet and say, well, actually I'm going to include, but it doesn't mean that I need to recode everything else, right? Because the outcome variable in that paper will still be the same. But again, and that will be the conclusion, again, it's the first time that I'm presenting this methodology, and so hopefully it will be published soon and improved. And if you want to try it in your own discipline, in your own type of research, if you find out that it works or that it doesn't work, or if you want to suggest improvement, please just let me know. I'd be delighted to get your feedback. Thank you very much.